It is fairly easy to fall under the impression that the West, Europe in particular, is declining right now. Slow or no economic growth, aging population, lack of innovation, a war on our borders, and a comprehensive inability to contain autocracies and dictators. But is it really the whole picture? Is really the rest better off than the West? Good evening. My name is Mateusz Mazzini, and this is our second special edition of Wider View, recorded here at the European Forum Alpbach. We're in the very heart of Europe, but we also need to face a rather difficult question. Is Europe still a beating heart of the world, as it once used to be? How dependent, not just militarily, but also politically, are we on the United States? How fearful should we be of China? Do we retain any leverage whatsoever in places like Latin America or the Middle East? Even if answers to these questions are uncomfortable, we try to get to them in our first report.
2024 has been labeled the year of global elections, with roughly 2 billion people heading to the polls. Voting has taken or will take place in over 60 countries and the EU, the world's largest supranational bloc. As elections in France, Great Britain, India and elsewhere are concluded, Europe's attention turns to the United States. But with so many twists and turns in America's prolonged presidential race, any attempt to predict the outcome is inevitably a fool's errand. That's why more and more countries are choosing to conduct their affairs without regard for developments in Washington. China is a good example of that new modality. Xi Jinping regularly skips multilateral meetings of traditional diplomatic bodies such as the United Nations General Assembly. At the same time, he continues to develop a sophisticated network of new international deals and connections. China is inching closer to Russia, and its support for Moscow in the war against Ukraine is no longer just an open secret. The BRICS format is growing in strength, with new members from Africa and the Middle East joining the organization. Last year, Xi even pushed for all trade between BRICS countries to be carried out in the UN. The motion was blocked by opposition from India and Brazil, but Beijing is likely to relaunch the project soon. It's also strengthened ties with sanctioned autocracies, including Iran and Venezuela. Other parts of the world have also seen major shakeups, which Europe has only witnessed from the sidelines. The conflict in Gaza has dominated global headlines, but proposals by European countries to hold peace talks have been turned down. South America was recently shaken by another wave of unrest in Venezuela. Over 8 million people have left the country since 2015, according to the United Nations. European election observers were initially supposed to oversee the country's presidential race, but were ultimately denied entry by the Maduro regime. The US lifted sanctions for 6 months, hoping to foster a democratic transition, but this only gave Maduro a financial lifeline. He stole the election again and unleashed another wave of repression. Brazil and Colombia are trying to mediate, as the EU has no leverage and Washington has other priorities. As the war in Ukraine drags on, China rises, and the Middle East is on fire, many are talking about the decline of the West. This is certainly a very seductive narrative, as both Europe and the US have no shortage of problems. But America remains the largest military and economic power in the world. The European Union is still a model for regional integration. And democracy is the most desired system of governance. The West might be getting weaker, but reports of its death have been greatly exaggerated.
How much does Europe matter? And what do others think of Europe? Those are not easy questions to answer. And the answer could really be a bitter pill to swallow. But even if that's the case, we'll try to explore these topics with the help of two fantastic guests. Arancha Gonzalez Laya Dean of the International Affairs at Sciences Po in Paris, and Pierre Heilbronn, Special Envoy of the French government for relief and reconstruction of Ukraine. Good evening.
Good evening.
Arancha, I want to begin by asking for a bird's eye view of where Europe really stands right now in the geopolitics of the world. Because it's, as we discussed before, fairly easy to see or fall under the impression that maybe the world outside Europe is actually getting ahead of us. Is this, especially from a diplomatic point of view, a right assessment, would you say?
Well, I would say that the world is changing. Actually, the world has changed. The paradigm that is moving the world has changed. It used to be manage interdependence, and through that you can generate peace and stability. And this paradigm is being replaced, slowly but very surely, by a power competition, a power relation, rivalry in particular between the US and China. And the big question for the EU is, what does the EU do to adjust to this new world? Does the EU, and there are two views in Europe at the moment. One view says, in order to adjust to the world, let's give more power to nation states. Let's go back to the 19th century, right? Let's retreat behind national borders. And there is another group, pretty loud, among which I sit, which says the only answer for the European Union to adjust to this new world is to become more integrated, become more powerful, becoming more united. Integrating in the areas where we have fallen short in the past, whether it's defense, whether it's on the economic side, where the answer is not to retreat, but to double down. It's an open competition. We saw this in the European elections a few months ago. We've seen this in national elections. Every time we go to the poll, these two versions of Europe are on the ballot. I have to say that for now, European citizens seem to think that the Europe more united is stronger. Europe is what will protect European citizens. This is what election after election we are seeing, although we should not underestimate the power of the ones who want to return to the nation state.
So even though you'd say that the split isn't 50-50 between the vision of Europe fallen behind this toxic word of sovereignty, as it is very often, and the more integrated vision of this, there is a likelihood that the first one can actually rise into power and be the prevalent one.
Well, it's very noisy. And this is why we have to confront this noise with facts.
Noisy, but somehow inefficient still.
Well, you know, we have to be very determined, because we should not be caught off guard. We should take this in our hands. So we have to fight the noise that says that more sovereignty would protect you more national sovereignty would protect you more. And we have to explain how did this protect the European citizens during the fight against COVID. How much of the answer was behind the nation states, and how much we Europeans managed to serve the COVID by integrating health, by vaccinating all European citizens at the same time, and by pulling sovereignty on the fiscal side to stimulate together, to invest together as a European Union into our market. We have to confront noise with facts, which in my view is the easier way to convince the citizens of where to choose.
Pierre, I want to turn to you now and talk about a case study of that modality of action that we've just discussed with Arancha. In touching upon your expertise in Ukraine, would you say that it's a fair assessment that Europe could still do more, not just militarily and financially, but also politically/diplomatically, to support Kiev against the Russian violence?
No, obviously, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine has been a wake-up call for Europe and for the world in many ways. For Europe, especially, I think, given the fact that we had sometimes very different historical ties with Ukraine among European countries, and that the unity of Europe has been tested, and we always see the half-empty glass. I think the half-full glass is the one of unity against around sanctions against Russia, the capacity, obviously, to put together in quite a creative way the instruments and resources to start supporting militarily Ukraine, which was really something which was not coming in the traditional DNA of European construction and European instruments. And I think also a clear view that we are living in a world of competition where power matters and where collective action can make a difference. We are sometimes surprised. I'm going to Ukraine every month or every month and a half. We are sometimes surprised when we go out of Europe that Europe is a very attractive model when you are talking to
Still
young
a very
Ukrainians.
attractive model.
But even in terms of fabric of the society, in terms of freedom and freedom also to think the world as one wants to make. And I think the question is very much how we can undermine, if you want, the poison of national sovereignty or local closed sovereignty by a European open sovereignty, which asserts itself in front of big powers, but also which brings the set of values and the set of models we've been able to build in Europe, and sometimes we forgot how precious it was.
So whilst I think the three of us are pretty much in agreement that Europe is still a very attractive model, I don't think everybody necessarily shares that opinion. And one of those is probably the obstructionist in chief of many European collective initiatives, and that is Viktor Orban. And on that note, Arancha, I want to turn to you and ask you, I think, a rather straightforward question. Given his mission to first Kiev, then to Moscow, and then to Beijing straight away, let's not forget about that, and quite a loud set of comments to remove the power of the presidency from Hungary right now, do you think that European Union, has learned a lesson of the troublemakers and dealing with troublemakers and will be finally able to contain Orban and the likes of him?
Well, first let me express my utmost respect for a leader that has been democratically elected in a European Union member state. But let me also be very clear that he does not represent the center of gravity of the European Union. And every European Union member state has said that and made that clear. And to the point that Viktor Orban himself has had to explain that he was not doing this with a mandate from the European Union, but rather on his own volition. I mean, I think, just like Pierre mentioned, I think that our biggest strategic asset is unity. So when we don't display unity, when we weaken ourselves from within, we are showing to the world where they can put their finger. So, which is why we have to be very clear, the rest of us have to be very clear that there is no hole to poke in the European Union. I think this is where we have to display our unity. In the case of Ukraine, against all odds, when people were saying that the Europeans would divide themselves, when the Europeans would not support Ukraine, when there would be weakened Europe vis-à-vis Ukraine, we have shown our ability to maintain our financial commitment, our defense commitment, but more importantly, our political commitment to the existence of a free and whole Ukraine. So that's the avenue. That's the avenue.
Yes, but on the other hand, when you look at, again, Viktor Orban himself, who eases visa restrictions for Russian and Belarusian citizens, who removes financial protection for over 3,000 Ukrainian refugees residing in Hungary, doesn't that send a mixed message to Moscow? Isn't he still creating the hole that we're all trying to patch?
So let's be very clear. I mean, this is not the first time that we go through this. We've gone through 13 packages of sanctions. Before every package of sanctions against Russia that the EU has adopted, there has been a negative from Hungary. The position has been, no, we would not support it. After each one of these packages of sanctions, Hungary has had to support each one of these packages of sanctions. Let's not make it easier for those who want to undermine the EU unity. Let's not make it easier. let's make it more difficult. Let's confront that and let's push ahead, which is our only antidote, is to show the rest of us that we want to move ahead together in unity, not weakening the European Union. Now for that, we have to do a lot of work because Viktor Orban, he is in power, but there are other political parties in Europe who are not in power, but who feel the same temptation. And this is where we need to make this also a political issue in each one of the political elections that we will face in the next months, starting from the one that Austria will face very soon, which is also, this also has to be part of the debate.
So once we're on the topic of scenarios for future, let's talk about the day after, Pierre, in Ukraine. I know you deal with relief and reconstruction, and I wanted to ask you, perhaps a larger theoretical question, how do you come about thinking about a reconstruction of a country that's still at war?
So I used to say that reconstruction is probably not the most appropriate term because
that features in your title.
Yes, but in fact, because it brings very different views. Some say, "Oh, what are you talking about? We are talking about the very distant future." Ukrainians approach reconstruction as something which is happening now. What is very striking when you go there is that in regions which were freed from Russian occupation, most highways, most bridges have been rebuilt already. So it's not a distant future. And there is a third dimension, which is sometimes not very much seen, is that we are not talking about bricks and mortar. We are talking about a transformation of a country which goes, and reconstruction goes much beyond physical reconstruction. It's creating also a new society. It's building also a new hope through also very social dimensions which are not encapsulated by physical reconstruction. So I wouldn't say that it's the day after we have to prepare. We have to first do our job now, and my job is, to know how and to bring also the European private companies, but also the multilateral development institution in support of Ukraine being able to go through the winter and to have the energy generation capacity, the interconnection with the European market, to be able to stay on its 2 feet in the next 6 months. But it's dealing with that, and together dealing with a full-fledged, more or less, reconstruction, if you want, which would attract worldwide private capital in the country in the very distant future. And the commonality of all that is also the European perspective of Ukraine, because Europe is about transformation, and enlargement is about transformation. And I think even if the origin of our ambition in the Western Balkans, we talk a lot about in Alpbach, which was around reconciliation of countries, there we talk about another ambition, which has something in common and which is linked to reconstruction.
So let's talk about the other end of that equation, because we tend to focus a lot on Ukraine, but of course Russia is not going to disappear out of the picture independent of the outcome of the war. What are the red lines that Europe should not cross before re-establishing diplomatic relations with Russia? In other words, what will have to happen for us to be able to sit by a negotiating table with Moscow?
I think red lines is sometimes a tricky word, because we've seen that obviously Russia has no red lines, and putting ourselves, putting always red lines is not the most efficient way of approaching the future. What is very important, I think, is the respect of the values which we all believe in. By the way, Russia has signed for it the United Nations obviously rules, the one which obviously back the international order, justice being applied also when there are war crimes like it's happening every day in Ukraine. So I think that's That's the basic principle the international community is defending there. Afterwards, how we come to a point where Russia is able and willing to come to this table, that's a problem first for Russia, and I think we've been very clear on that. And obviously the capacity of Europe and ourselves to show strength and unity, as was very well said before, over a sustained period of time, because it's easy probably in 1 month or 2 months or 6 months, but over a sustained period of time, resisting to disinformation, resisting to all the seeds of division is one test case for Europe.
So let's talk about the other elephant in the room with you, Arancha, the US presidential election. It's a big event. It usually has repercussions for everybody on the planet. But this year it feels somehow more real than ever, mostly because of the war in Ukraine and other conflicts. But Europe is actually in a somewhat paradoxical situation. On the one hand, we fear that should Trump come back to the White House, he will decrease military and diplomatic involvement in the United States. But maybe that actually presents an opportunity for Europe to become less dependent on external security providers. What are your views on that?
Yeah, this first presidential election in the US has taken a turn, an unexpected turn.
And there might be other turns.
For the better, let's say,
Yeah.
for the better. And I'm saying this because on the ballot, the US citizens, we don't vote, we Europeans don't vote, but the US citizens will have to choose between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. We knew them both. We know Donald Trump. We know his hostility towards the European Union. We know how he undermined the European Union on the economic front, also on the defense front, very clearly during his first mandate in the White House. We know of Kamala Harris. We know how she's been weaving alliances with the European Union together with President Joe Biden, whether it's on Ukraine, whether it's on technology. It's true that on the economic front, the scene is a little bit more mixed. But irrespective of who the Americans choose, it's their choice, it's not ours. So I think the only wise thing we Europeans can do and should do is make sure we take our future in our hands. We do not put our future in the hands of the US elector, of the US voter. We take it in our hands. And the recipe is pretty simple. We have to get stronger in two areas where we have not done our homework. First is defense and security, where we have to invest more, and we have to invest collectively as a union, simply because the return will be much better. And we have to strengthen our economy, because we know that we grow at around 1.5%. There is no reason why we shouldn't grow at 2.5%.
Or even more.
But this is a function of two things. One is called demography, which is why we have to have a serious discussion about migration. And the second is integrating the markets in energy, in technology, which are the two big areas where we're lagging behind. So we know these are our two weak spots. We should be investing in them. Thirdly, we should not forget Europe equals democracy. We are a democratic space. So we have to double down also on protecting our democratic spaces. At a time when we've seen a weakening of democracy in the US, we have to make sure that we do not give ideas in Europe to those who want to weaken democracy. We have to double down on protecting it, on ensuring checks and balances, and respecting fundamental rights, and ensuring the rule of law is the rule of the EU.
Well, striking then a rather optimistic tone, I think, from the heart of Europe here in Alpbach. Europe remains democratic, remains strong, and remains committed to the principles and values upon which the European Union, I think, was founded on. Arancha Gonzalez Laya, Pierre Heilbronn, thank you very much for joining us here at European Forum Alpbach.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being with us tonight. That was the second edition of Wider View, straight from European Forum Alpbach. Next week, we'll be back at our studio in Warsaw. See you next Thursday, and have a good evening.